So we're on Daf Hey Amid Beis, and you can count about 20 lines up from the bottom, and you'll see a line that starts with the word Kra. Yosiv Rav Nachman, or Rav Sheshes, Yosiv Rav Ada Bar Masna Gabayu. So Rav Ada Bar Ada is like the third Amora, the third rabbi. He's the one who's going to answer all the questions. The Yasvi Kamrin, here's the question they asked. Had Ka'amar Rabbi Elazar, Matzinu biboyin li achar misa shen ksherim v'eina meratzim. So let's just review quickly. Reish Lakish denied the possibility of a carbon that's brought on the mizbeach without any kapara, without any ritzui. And Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Lazar, responded by saying, well, there is such a thing as a carbon that's brought liachar misa, and there's no ritzui in the carbon because there's no ritzui for a dead person, but yet the carbon is kosher. And the Yarshim, the heirs, will bring their father's carbon that was designated during his lifetime. So the Gemara is a little bit upset as to why Reish Lakish accepted that argument and that proof of Rabbi Lazar. Lema le Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish could have easily had responded and say Hanu nami laisu velirtu. In other words, you're assuming Rabbi Lazar, and apparently Reish Lakish accepted it, that the Yarshim are bringing a carbon that they inherited from their father, and that carbon has no element of kapara at all, because the ritzui can only be for the one who owns the carbon, the bailim, and he's gone. So there's no ritzui lachar misa. That was the premise that underlined Rabbi Elazar's argument. So the Gemara is asking, what do you mean? Why didn't Reish Lakish just respond by saying that the carbon that's brought by the Yarshim is going to be mechaper for the Yarshim themselves, because they become now the owners of the carbon? And once again, then Rabbi Lazar's argument that here's a precedent for a carbon that's brought on the mizbeach without ritzui is a mistaken premise. Amalahem Rav Ada Bar Masna, the Gemara answers. Now you have to keep in mind that when Rabbi Lazar quoted a Mishnah to prove that there's a carbon liachar misa that has no ritzui, and yet it's a carbon kosher, that Mishnah was in regard to what's called the yoledes. And the yoledes has to bring a whole series of karbanos after her birth. So Rav Ada Bar Masna, I said he was like the third Mora who stood at the sidelines, and he's going to solve this problem. He's going to say, he yolda banem yoldu? Could it make sense that the carbon of the mother who gave birth would be meaningful on behalf of the Yarshim who did not give birth? So, she needs, let's say, a ritzui because she gave birth. Chazal say maybe she took a shvu, whatever it is. But the Yarshim, didn't give birth. So it would be meaningless to say that they have any sort of benefit from this carbon, any sort of ritzui from this carbon. And therefore, Rabbi Lazar, when he brought this Mishnah in Yoledes as a proof that there is such a thing as a carbon that's kosher without ritzui, he was well justified. Don't ask me any questions about the fact that the Yarshim themselves could achieve kapara. The Yarshim didn't give birth. Maskif lo Ravasi, but Ravasi says, "Human lemalon to ika kama asega bolo miskapra." Wait a second. Let's say that when the Yoledes was alive, and she brought, let's say, a carbon ola, which is one of the carbonas that she has to bring, the Ola could be mechaper for a mitzvah say that she didn't fulfill. Let's say she didn't, I don't know, light Shabbos candles or something like that. So therefore, if the carbon during her lifetime, the carbon yoletis would have been meaningful to create a ritzi for other averos, not connected to Leda, then maybe the Yarshim would achieve likewise a kapar for a mitzvah say that they didn't fulfill, that they were mevatel, in which case Rabbi Elazar's argument falls off, and then we once again raise the question why Reish Lakish didn't reject it. Meaning that even in the case of Liachar Misa, there is a kapar for the Yarshim who now slip into the shoes of the Morish, of the father that died, and they will achieve a kapara for their sins like he would have the father in his lifetime. So at this point, I think the Gemara is very, very satisfied. And once again, we understand that there's no precedent for a carbon that's kosher without ritzui, lememer dekanya lehu. But then your premise is that the Yarshim inherit the carbon of their father. Now, if we were learning this with what we call brisker ilun, you'd have to say that the bilus that we're talking about now operates within a very limited, specific, and unique modus operandus, meaning it's operating within the context of kodshim, and it doesn't have anything to do with choshim mishpat and how you acquire bilus. Certainly, a yoresh acquires bilus, but we're talking about bilus for the purpose of bringing the carbon on your name. And now you're assuming that the children of the Oledes could become the Bailim of this carbon, and now they, like their mother, could bring the carbon as a kapara for a bittul mitzaseh. Va'omar Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to have a whole bunch of statements of Rabbi Yochanan. Hiniach mincha l'shnei banav hu meis, kreva v'ein bo shutvis. Okay, now there's a special halacha in mincha that a carbon mincha cannot be brought by shutfim. The Torah is going to say nefesh in the singular to teach you that a mincha has to be brought by one individual, not by two. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan postulates that if the father had a carbon mincha and he died, and he has two sons to inherit him, then they l'chora are shutfim, and there's no shutfis in a mincha, and therefore the mincha is psula. No, Rabbi Yochanan says kreva and aimbo shutfis. We don't view this as shutfis. Now, what does it mean that we don't view them as shutfim? There's the ownership that is required in the laws of Kodshim does not get generated by Yerusha. Bisal Kedaitach Kanyalahu, Nefesh Omerachmana. The Torah says Nefesh regarding a mincha in the singular to teach me that a carbon mincha cannot be brought by Shutfim. How can then Rabbi Yochanan say that the carbon mincha that was inherited by the sons could be brought? The answer is because they didn't inherit it, and there's no shutfis, and they're not called shutfim. Now, we were saying that in the case of the Yoledes, when she dies, the Yarshim become Bailim, they now own the carbon, and therefore they'll bring it as a ritzu for their own violations. But now we're proving from this statement of Rabbi Yochanan that there's no such thing as the Bailis for a carbon that's transferred over through inheritance. So the Gemara says, are you sure v'lo kanyule? I'm going to quote another statement of Rabbi Yochanan, and I'm going to prove that Rabbi Yochanan holds there is a kinyan. Now, this has to do with what's called tmura, And, we're not learning Masechta Tmura, but the problem with Kodshim is that everything overlaps. And just like we said that there's a special halach in Karban Mincha that Shutfim do not bring a Karban Mincha, there's a special halach in Tmura that Shutfim do not create Tmura. So let's say if you have two partners that own the Karban, and they would go ahead and point to another animal and say that animal should be Tmura, should be a replacement for this animal that we own B'Shutfis, that Tmura is not valid. So again, Shutfis and Tmura are mutually exclusive concepts. And Rabbi Yochanan says, so there's no Tmura on behalf of the Yorshim. The Yorshim can't create from another animal an animal of Chulin onto this animal that they inherited. They can't create Tmura. It means they own Shutfis in the animal. So on the one hand, we seem to assume that according to Rabbi Yochanan, there is no bilus le'inyan carbon that is generated by the Yerusha, and therefore Rabbi Yochanan says that hiniach banov, in the case of a carbon mincha, they can't bring the mincha is possible. I'm sorry. The mincha should be possible because of shutfim, and yet Rabbi Yochanan says the mincha is not possible because there's no shutfim, because there's no kinyan. And yet Rabbi Yochanan, in the case of Tmura, is saying that these two Yarshim cannot be Meimir because they are shutfim, meaning that there is a kinyan. Amrit bishlem akanyalahu, hainu de'em amirinba. I can only understand Rabbi Yochanan's statement that these two brothers who inherited their father's korban cannot do a Tmura on it if I understand that they acquired ownership. And then there's Shutfis, and Shutfis cannot do that act of Tmura. Tahavile Shutfis. So here Rabbi Yochanan seems to be maintaining that there is Bailus through Yerusha on the Karban,